I still remember the exact words my mother screamed at me that cold October morning. "Get out of my house, you disgrace." The pregnancy test was still warm in my trembling hands when she slammed the front door so hard that our family photo fell off the wall and shattered. I was 16, pregnant, and suddenly homeless, standing on the sidewalk in my pajamas with nothing but shame and terror consuming every inch of my soul. 24 hours earlier, I thought I had the perfect life. My boyfriend Jake had just gotten accepted to Oxford University in England, the opportunity of a lifetime that his wealthy parents had been planning since he was 5. We were going to figure out the long-distance thing, or so I believed. But when I showed him those 2 pink lines, his face went completely white, and he said words that still echo in my nightmares. "This isn't my problem anymore, Emma. I'm not letting you ruin my future." His parents didn't even look at me when I knocked on their door, begging for help. His mother simply said through the intercom, "Our son leaves for England next week. This conversation is over." Click. Just like that. 3 years of what I thought was love vanished into thin air, leaving me with nothing but a growing life inside me and nowhere to turn. My own parents' reaction was even worse. Dad called me names I can't repeat, and Mom acted like I had committed some unforgivable sin. "You've embarrassed this family enough," she said, throwing my clothes into garbage bags. "Figure it out yourself." The door slammed, the locks clicked, and I found myself alone on the street, my long black hair whipping in the wind, tears streaming down my face. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly understand in that moment of absolute despair, was that sometimes God closes every door you think you need, just to open the one you never knew existed. Standing there on that sidewalk, clutching my few belongings, I felt like my world had completely collapsed. The October wind cut through my thin jacket as I walked aimlessly through downtown Portland, Oregon, my clear blue eyes scanning every street corner for somewhere, anywhere I could find shelter. I had exactly $43 in my wallet, no job, no family support, and a baby growing inside me that deserved so much better than this nightmare. That's when I found myself standing in front of St. Catherine's Catholic Church. I had never been religious. My family only went to church for weddings and funerals, but something about those tall wooden doors called to me. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was instinct, but I pushed them open and stepped into a world that would change everything. The story I'm about to share with you isn't just about teenage pregnancy or family rejection. It's about divine intervention in ways I never imagined possible. It's about finding hope when everything seems hopeless, discovering love when you think you're unlovable, and learning that God's plan is always bigger than our biggest problems. Before I continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please comment below with your city and country. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support means the world to me. And I promise this story will show you just how beautifully God can turn our greatest trials into our greatest triumphs. Now, let me take you back to that moment when I stepped through those church doors, scared and alone, not knowing I was about to meet the angel who would save my life. The church was darker than I expected, with afternoon sunlight filtering through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across empty wooden pews. My footsteps echoed in the vast silence as I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would wake the dead. I had never felt so small, so lost, so completely abandoned by everyone I thought loved me. The smell of old wood and candles filled my nostrils as I collapsed into the front pew, finally allowing myself to break down completely. I sobbed until my chest ached, until my eyes burned, until I had no tears left to cry. That's when I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. I looked up through my blurred vision to see a woman in a black habit looking down at me with the most compassionate eyes I had ever seen. She appeared to be in her 50s, with kind wrinkles around her eyes and a smile that seemed to radiate pure love. "Child," she said softly, "what brings you to God's house in such distress?" Her name was Sister Margaret, and something about her voice made me feel safe enough to tell her everything. Through hiccuped sobs, I explained about the pregnancy, about Jake leaving for Oxford, about my parents throwing me out like garbage. I told her about having nowhere to go, no money, no plan, nothing but fear and this tiny life growing inside me that I was already failing before it was even born. I expected judgment, lectures about premarital sex, or at least disappointment. Instead, Sister Margaret sat beside me and held my hand. "Emma," she said, and hearing my name spoken with such tenderness made me cry all over again. God has a way of bringing his children exactly where they need to be, exactly when they need to be there. You didn't wander into this church by accident. You were led here. She helped me to my feet and guided me toward a side door I hadn't noticed before. "Come with me, dear one. Let's get you fed and somewhere safe to rest." Behind that door was a whole world I never knew existed. St. Catherine's ran a home for women in crisis, young mothers, abuse survivors, homeless women trying to get back on their feet. Sister Margaret showed me to a small but clean room with a single bed, a desk, and a window that looked out onto a beautiful garden. "This is yours for as long as you need it," she said, placing fresh towels on the bed. "No questions, no judgment, no conditions, just love." That first night, lying in that narrow bed, I touched my still flat stomach and whispered to my baby, "I don't know how we're going to make it, little one, but maybe we're not as alone as I thought." For the first time in days, I felt something other than terror. I felt a tiny spark of hope. The other women in the home welcomed me like family, sharing their own stories of hardship and redemption over communal dinners that felt more loving than any meal I'd ever had at my parents' table. Sister Margaret enrolled me in the home's GED program since I'd had to drop out of high school. She also connected me with a kind doctor who agreed to provide my prenatal care for free. "Education and health care are not luxuries," she told me firmly. "They're rights, especially for young mothers building their futures." Every morning, she would check on me, bringing tea and homemade cookies, asking about my dreams and plans like I was someone worth investing in. Within a week, I had a routine that felt almost normal. Morning prayers, which I attended more out of respect than belief. Breakfast with the other women, GED classes, afternoon rest, helping in the church garden, evening meals, and study time. The other residents became like sisters to me. Maria, who was escaping an abusive relationship. Janet, a recovering addict fighting for custody of her children. And Sarah, barely 18 and pregnant with twins after aging out of foster care. But it was during my evening walks in the church garden that I began to feel something changing inside me. Not just my body, which was slowly beginning to show signs of pregnancy, but my spirit. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely cared for without conditions. Sister Margaret never asked me to pay rent, never made me feel like a burden, never suggested I should be grateful for charity. She simply loved me, completely and unconditionally, the way I imagined a mother should love her daughter. One evening, about 3 weeks after my arrival, Sister Margaret found me crying softly on the garden bench. "What's troubling you tonight, dear?" she asked, settling beside me with a gentle sigh. I told her about feeling guilty for being happy, for starting to heal when my baby's father was probably having the time of his life at Oxford, completely unburdened by the consequences of our actions. Emma, she said, taking my hands in hers, healing isn't betrayal. Choosing joy isn't abandoning justice. God doesn't want you to suffer forever to prove a point. He wants you to thrive, to become the mother your child deserves. That night, for the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's, I knelt beside my bed and actually prayed, not because I had to, not because someone was watching, but because I finally understood that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't facing this alone after all. God, I whispered into the darkness, I don't know if you're real, but if you are, please help me be strong enough for this baby. Help me be the kind of mother who never makes her child feel unwanted. I fell asleep with my hands on my belly, finally feeling like maybe everything was going to be okay. 2 months into my stay at St. Catherine's, life had settled into a rhythm I never expected to find comforting. My morning sickness had mostly passed, and the tiny bump barely showing through my sweaters served as a daily reminder of the miracle growing inside me. I was excelling in my GED classes, particularly in English and literature, discovering a talent for writing that I never knew I possessed. Sister Margaret encouraged me to keep a journal, not just about the pregnancy, but about my dreams and aspirations for the future. But peace, I was learning, doesn't always last. On a rainy Tuesday in December, everything changed when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered, Emma. The voice was shaky, familiar, and filled with tears. It was Jake's mother, Mrs. Richardson, the same woman who had dismissed me through her intercom just months earlier. I need to speak with you. Can we meet? My hands were trembling as I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown. Sister Margaret insisted on driving me, sensing my anxiety. Whatever she has to say, Sister Margaret told me as we pulled up to the cafe, remember that you are strong, you are loved, and you are exactly where God wants you to be. I nodded, but my heart was racing as I walked through those glass doors, my stomach now noticeably rounded beneath my coat. Mrs. Richardson looked like she had aged years in just a few months. Her usually perfect blonde hair was disheveled. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook as she clutched her coffee cup. Emma, she began, her voice cracking. I owe you an apology. That's months overdue. She told me that Jake had been struggling at Oxford, that he'd been calling home in tears every night, overwhelmed by guilt and regret about abandoning me and his child. But that's not why I'm here, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. 3 weeks ago, Jake was in a terrible accident, a car crash near the university. My heart stopped. Despite everything he had put me through, despite the abandonment and cruelty, he was still the father of my child. He's alive, she quickly assured me, but he's in a coma. The doctors, they don't know if he'll wake up. The room seemed to spin around me as she continued talking through her tears. Before the accident, he had written you a letter. Dozens of letters, actually, but never sent them. I found them in his room when I flew to England. She pulled a wrinkled envelope from her purse, with my name written in Jake's familiar handwriting. Emma, I'm so sorry for how we treated you. I was wrong. My husband was wrong. And Jake was wrong. We were so focused on protecting his future that we forgot about protecting what was right. Reading that letter in the coffee shop was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Jake poured his heart out on those pages, describing his regret, his sleepless nights, his desperate wish to come home and be the father our child deserved. He wrote about how he'd realized that Oxford meant nothing without honor, That success, built on abandoning responsibility, wasn't success at all. The letter ended with a plea for forgiveness and a promise to spend his life making things right, if I would give him the chance. Mrs. Richardson was crying openly now, not caring about the other cafe patrons staring at us. "Emma, I know we don't deserve your forgiveness. I know we failed you when you needed us most. But if there's any chance Jake wakes up, I want him to know his child. I want to be the grandmother I should have been from the beginning." She slid a check across the table, more money than I'd ever seen in my life. "This is for you and the baby. No strings attached. Whether Jake recovers or not, whether you forgive us or not, this child is my grandchild, and I want to provide for them." I stared at that check, my mind reeling. 6 months ago, this money would have solved every problem I thought I had. Now, sitting in this cafe with my hand on my growing belly, I realized that my problems had become blessings in disguise. "Mrs. Richardson," I said quietly, "I forgive you, not because you're offering money, not because Jake is hurt, but because carrying anger in my heart hurts my baby more than it hurts you." I folded the check and handed it back to her. "But I can't take this money. I've learned that charity without relationship is just guilt management." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Then what can I do? How can I make this right?" I thought about Sister Margaret, about the women at St. Catherine's, about the community that had embraced me when my own family had rejected me. "Be present," I told her. "Don't try to buy your way into our lives. Earn your way in. Show up consistently, whether it's convenient or not. And if Jake recovers, he needs to do the same." Walking back to Sister Margaret's car, I felt emotionally drained but somehow lighter. I had faced the past and chosen forgiveness over bitterness. But as Sister Margaret drove us back to the church, she glanced at me with concern. "How are you feeling about all this, dear?" she asked gently. I placed my hand on my stomach, feeling the baby's gentle movements. "Like God is preparing me for something bigger than I ever imagined," I answered. I had no idea how right I was. That night, I wrote in my journal until my hand cramped. Today, I learned that forgiveness isn't about the other person deserving it. It's about me deserving peace, and my baby deserves a mother who chooses love over anger, hope over bitterness, faith over fear. Whatever comes next, we're ready. Spring arrived at St. Catherine's like a promise kept. The garden Sister Margaret tended so lovingly burst into bloom just as my pregnancy entered its final trimester. At 7 months pregnant, I had become something of the house mascot. The other women would rub my belly for luck and joke that my baby was blessed by all the prayers said over them every night. My GED was complete. I had been accepted to community college for the fall with childcare provided, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a real future ahead of me. That's when Father Michael arrived. Sister Margaret's brother had been serving as a missionary in Guatemala for 15 years, but a severe case of malaria had forced him to return to the United States for treatment and recovery. I first saw him on a sunny April morning as I was tending to the tomato plants in the garden, my swollen belly making it difficult to bend over. A deep voice behind me said, "You know, those plants will grow better if you talk to them while you work." I turned around to see a man who looked remarkably like Sister Margaret, the same kind eyes, the same gentle smile, but with dark hair peppered with silver and laugh lines that spoke of joy despite whatever hardships he'd faced. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, and there was something about his presence that made me feel immediately at ease. "I'm Father Michael," he said, extending a dirt-covered hand. "But everyone calls me Father Mike. You must be Emma. My sister has told me so much about you." Over the following weeks, Father Mike became a unexpected presence in my daily routine. Unlike the other priests I'd met who seemed to maintain a formal distance, he was approachable and genuinely interested in each woman's story. He would join us for dinner, help with household repairs, and offer counseling that felt more like conversations with a wise friend than religious lectures. But it was his interactions with me that surprised everyone, including myself. Father Mike had a gift for asking the right questions at the right time. During one of our garden sessions, as I struggled to stake some bean plants, he asked Emma, "What do you want your child to remember about these early days?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on surviving day by day that I hadn't thought much about the memories I was creating. "I want them to remember feeling wanted," I answered without hesitation. "I want them to know that even when the world seemed to reject us, we found a place where love was stronger than judgment." "That's beautiful," he said, helping me tie the plants to their stakes. "But what do you want them to remember about you specifically? Not about this place, not about the circumstances, but about the woman who chose to give them life when it would have been easier to give up." His question made me realize that I had been defining myself by my circumstances rather than by my choices. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "I am not a victim of teenage pregnancy. I am a woman who chose life, who chose hope, who chose to become the person my child needs me to be." As my due date approached, Father Mike became increasingly protective in a way that surprised everyone, including Sister Margaret. When Mrs. Richardson continued to call, wanting to be involved in the birth, it was Father Mike who suggested I needed to make decisions based on my own comfort, not others' guilt. When the father of my baby's recovery remained uncertain, it was Father Mike who reminded me that I was already giving my child everything they needed, a mother who loved them unconditionally. But the most surprising moment came during a late evening in May, just 2 weeks before my due date. I was having trouble sleeping, as pregnant women often do, and had wandered into the church sanctuary to sit quietly in the peaceful darkness. I found Father Mike there, kneeling in prayer before the altar. He looked up when I entered, and instead of being embarrassed about interrupting his private time with God, he smiled and patted the pew beside him. "Can't sleep either?" he asked gently. I shook my head, settling beside him with some difficulty due to my size. "I keep thinking about what happens after the baby comes," I admitted. "Everyone's been so focused on getting me through the pregnancy, but what about after? What kind of life can I really provide? What if I'm not enough?" The questions that had been haunting me for weeks poured out in the darkness. Father Mike was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Emma, do you know what I've learned in 15 years of ministry? The parents who worry about not being enough are exactly the ones who are enough. Love isn't about having all the answers or providing material perfection. Love is about showing up consistently with an open heart." He paused, then added something that shocked me. "Some of the best parents I've known started out with nothing but love and determination." But what if I started to say, but he gently interrupted. "What if you stopped asking what if and started asking what now? What now do you need to feel prepared? What now do you need to feel confident? What now do you need to feel supported?" His questions shifted something fundamental in my thinking. Instead of fearing an uncertain future, I began planning for the beautiful possibility that lay ahead. That night, sitting in that quiet sanctuary beside this man who had become such an unexpected source of wisdom and comfort, I felt my baby kick strongly, as if agreeing with everything Father Mike had said. "I think," I whispered, placing my hand on my belly, "we're going to be just fine." Father Mike smiled and said something I'll never forget. "Emma, you're not just going to be fine, you're going to be extraordinary." Labor began on a Tuesday morning in June, 3 days past my due date. I woke up to Sister Margaret gently shaking my shoulder, her face filled with excitement and concern. "It's time, dear one," she said softly. The contractions had started while I slept, and my body had been working without me even realizing it. By the time we arrived at the hospital, I was already 6 centimeters dilated, and the medical team was amazed at how calm I appeared to be. But inside, I was terrified. Not of the pain, not of the medical process, but of the moment when I would finally meet this little person I'd been carrying and talking to for 9 months. What if I didn't know how to love them enough? What if I wasn't the mother they deserved? Sister Margaret held one hand while Mrs. Richardson, who had earned her place there through months of consistent presence, held the other. Father Mike had been pacing the waiting room for hours, though I didn't know it at the time. The labor was intense but relatively quick. At 4:47 p.m., after 12 hours of contractions and 40 minutes of pushing, my daughter entered the world with a cry that sounded like pure joy. "She's perfect," the doctor announced, placing her on my chest before I could even catch my breath. And she was 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a head full of dark hair, just like mine. And when she opened her eyes for the first time, they were the brightest blue I'd ever seen. "Hello, beautiful," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm your mommy, and I love you so much." She seemed to recognize my voice, turning her head toward me and quieting her cries. In that moment, every fear I had harbored about not knowing how to love her disappeared. The love was immediate, overwhelming, and stronger than anything I'd ever felt. It was like my heart had suddenly doubled in size to accommodate this enormous feeling that had no name. I named her Grace Elizabeth Grace for the unmerited favor that had brought us to this moment, and Elizabeth after Sister Margaret, whose full name I learned that day was Margaret Elizabeth. When the nurse placed Grace in my arms for the first time after cleaning her up, I marveled at how something so small could feel so monumental. She was only 6 pounds and 3 ounces, but she had completely changed the trajectory of my entire life. Sister Margaret was crying openly, something I'd never seen her do. "She's going to change the world," she whispered, gently touching Grace's tiny hand. Mrs. Richardson, who had maintained her respectful distance throughout my pregnancy, asked quietly if she could hold her granddaughter. When I nodded, she took Grace with shaking hands, and I watched this woman who had once rejected us both fall completely in love with this tiny person who had Jake's nose and my determination. But it was when Father Mike finally entered the room that something unexpected happened. He approached my bedside with tears in his eyes, looking at Grace with such wonder that you would have thought she was his own child. "She's absolutely beautiful, Emma," he said softly. "Look at those eyes. They're going to see so much goodness in this world." When I offered to let him hold her, he accepted with the careful reverence of someone who understood how precious this moment was. As he held Grace, something shifted in the room. This man who had been a source of strength and wisdom throughout my pregnancy looked at my daughter like she was the most important person he'd ever met. And when Grace grabbed his finger with her tiny hand, he smiled in a way that transformed his entire face. "I think she likes you," I said, laughing despite my exhaustion. "I think I'm going to like her too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The next few days in the hospital were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, visitors, and overwhelming love. Grace was an easy baby. She slept well, nursed naturally, and seemed to regard the world around her with curious contentment. The nurses commented on how alert she was, how she seemed to study every face that appeared above her crib, This one's going to be special. One elderly nurse told me, I've been delivering babies for 30 years, and some just have that spark from the beginning. Mrs. Richardson surprised everyone by asking if she could stay and help during those first few days, not as someone trying to take over, but as a grandmother who wanted to learn how to be useful. She changed diapers, brought me meals, and held Grace when I needed to shower or sleep. I missed so much of Jake's infancy because I was focused on other things. She told me one evening, I won't make that mistake again. Sister Margaret barely left our side, teaching me practical things about newborn care while also sharing the deeper wisdom of motherhood. Trust your instincts, she told me as I worried about every little cry or movement. God gave mothers intuition for a reason. You'll know what she needs. And somehow I did. When Grace cried, I could sense whether she was hungry, tired, or just wanted to be held. It was like we had our own secret language from the very beginning. Father Mike visited every day, usually bringing flowers for me and tiny gifts for Grace, a soft blanket, a children's book, a small stuffed lamb. But more than the gifts, he brought conversation that helped me process the magnitude of what had just happened. How does it feel, he asked one afternoon, to know that everything in your life led to this moment? I looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in my arms, and realized he was right. Every heartbreak, every rejection, every moment of fear had been necessary to bring us to this perfect ending that was actually a beautiful beginning. 3 months after Grace was born, life had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. I had moved into a small apartment near St. Catherine's with help from the church's housing program, started my college classes online, and was working part-time at a local bookstore that allowed me to bring Grace with me. She was the most content baby, sleeping peacefully in her carrier while I shelved books or helped customers, charming everyone who met her with her bright eyes and ready smile. But what surprised me most was how naturally Father Mike had woven himself into our daily lives. What started as pastoral care had evolved into something deeper, genuine friendship and what felt like family. He would stop by every few days, ostensibly to check on how we were adjusting, but staying for dinner, helping with laundry, or just sitting on my small couch holding Grace while I studied. There was nothing inappropriate about his attention, nothing that crossed the lines of his vocation. But there was an undeniable connection that made me look forward to his visits more than I probably should have. One evening in September, as autumn painted the Portland sky in shades of gold and crimson, Father Mike arrived at my apartment looking unusually serious. Grace was having tummy time on a blanket in the living room, and I was preparing dinner when he knocked. "We need to talk," he said quietly. And my heart immediately began racing. Had I done something wrong? Was I reading too much into our friendship? Was he going to tell me that his visits needed to stop? Instead, he sat on my small couch and ran his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd never seen from him before. "Emma, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it all before you respond." I sat across from him, my stomach churning with anxiety. 15 years ago, I made a vow to God that I believed was the right path for my life. I promised to serve him by remaining celibate, by dedicating my life entirely to ministry and service. He paused, watching Grace kick her legs happily on the blanket. "But over these past months, watching you become the incredible mother I knew you would be, seeing your strength and faith and grace under pressure, something has changed in me, something I never expected to feel." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I've fallen in love with you, Emma, completely, hopelessly, irrevocably in love with you and with Grace." I opened my mouth to speak, but he held up his hand. I know what you're thinking. I know this is complicated and probably inappropriate and certainly unexpected. But I've prayed about this every single day for months, and I keep getting the same answer. Love is never wrong when it serves God's purpose. And you, Emma, you and Grace have shown me God's purpose in ways my 15 years of missionary work never could. Tears were streaming down my face as he continued. I've spoken with the bishop. I've requested laicization to be released from my vows so that I can choose a different path of service to God, a path that includes being the husband you deserve and the father Grace needs. He moved to kneel in front of where I sat, taking my hands in his. I'm not asking you to answer right now. I know this is overwhelming. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that maybe God brought us together not just to help you through a crisis, but to create something beautiful and lasting. The room was silent except for Grace's happy baby sounds and my own quiet sobbing. This man, who had become my anchor and my source of strength, was offering to give up everything he had dedicated his life to, for us. Michael, I whispered, using his name without the title for the first time. Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Because Grace and I, we come with complications. We come with a history and challenges, and he stopped me with the gentlest kiss on my forehead. Emma, you and Grace aren't complications. You're the answer to prayers I didn't even know I was praying. When I hold her, I feel like I'm holding my own daughter. When I'm with you, I feel like I'm exactly where God wants me to be. He pulled back to look directly into my eyes. I don't want to be just Father Mike anymore. I want to be Michael, your husband, Grace's father, the man who loves you both more than life itself. That night, after Michael left to give me time to think, I sat in Grace's nursery watching her sleep and trying to process everything that had just happened. This man, who had already been more of a father to my daughter in 3 months than her biological father had ever been, was willing to change his entire life for us, not out of pity or obligation, but out of love. Over the following weeks, as Michael navigated the complex process of laicization, we talked honestly about what a future together would look like. We discussed the challenges of his career change, the adjustment of going from priest to husband and father, the inevitable gossip from people who wouldn't understand our story, but we also talked about our dreams, his desire to work in social services, helping families in crisis, my plans to become a social worker myself, our shared vision of providing Grace with siblings who would grow up in a home filled with love and service to others. Sister Margaret, unsurprisingly, was our biggest supporter. I've watched my brother serve God faithfully for 15 years. She told me one afternoon as we folded laundry while Grace napped, but I've never seen him come alive the way he does with you and Grace. Sometimes God calls us to serve him in ways we never expected. The bishop's approval came through on a cold December morning, and Michael was officially released from his vows on New Year's Eve, the perfect symbol of new beginnings. 2 years later, I stood in the same sanctuary where I had once cried out in desperation, wearing my grandmother's wedding dress that Sister Margaret had carefully altered to fit me perfectly. Grace, now a spirited 2-year-old with her father's gentle nature and my stubborn determination, walked down the aisle scattering rose petals with the serious concentration only toddlers can muster. Michael waited at the altar, tears streaming down his face, as I approached the man who had loved us when we were unlovable and chosen us when we had been rejected by everyone else. Our wedding wasn't the fairy tale I had dreamed of as a little girl. It was better. It was real, built on a foundation of shared struggle, mutual respect, and a love that had been tested by real-life challenges. Mrs. Richardson sat in the front row, now Grandma Joan to Grace, having proven through consistent presence that love can overcome past mistakes. Even my own parents attended, having slowly learned that unconditional love is stronger than conditional approval. As Michael and I exchanged vows, we had written ourselves promising to love each other and Grace through whatever challenges lay ahead. I thought about that terrified 16-year-old girl who had stumbled into this church, thinking her life was over. She had no way of knowing that her greatest fear would become her greatest blessing, that her moment of deepest despair would lead to her most profound joy. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our worst fears, and His most beautiful plans are hidden in our most painful circumstances. Today, Grace calls Michael Daddy and has no memory of a time when he wasn't part of our lives. We're expecting our second child in the spring, a little boy we'll name Samuel, which means heard by God, because that's what our whole story has been about, being heard by a God who loves us enough to turn our ashes into beauty, our mourning into dancing, our rejection into the most perfect love story I never could have imagined. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to know that God's plan is always bigger than our problems, and His love is always stronger than our circumstances.